Commander Uvex had served at Monitoring Station 7 for 30 years, and she had never seen anything like this. The Velathari Empire had spent 12,000 years building the greatest sensor network in the galaxy, and every ship that moved through their space was tracked and identified and logged into the archives before it could travel more than a few light seconds. Nothing surprised them anymore, because they had seen everything, or so Uvex had believed until this moment. She stood in the command center with her 4 eyes locked on the holographic display, and her 2 hearts beating faster than they should, and her mind refusing to accept what the sensors were telling her. A vessel had appeared at the edge of the Korath system, and it had not come through any of the normal methods of faster than light travel. There was no hyperspace wake trailing behind it like a comet tail. There was no wormhole signature indicating it had punched through space from another location. There was no quantum displacement trail showing it had folded reality to move from one point to another. It had simply appeared as if it had always been there, and now it was moving, and the speed readings made no sense at all. Run the identification protocols again, Uvex ordered, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. Commander, I have run them 17 times already, said Officer Kethis, and his scales had turned pale with fear, which was something Uvex had never seen in him before. The vessel matches nothing in our archives, and I mean nothing at all. That is impossible, Uvex replied. We have records of every spacefaring civilization within 10,000 light years, and we have cataloged every ship design for the past 8,000 years. I know, Commander, but this vessel is not in our records, and there is more. Kethis pulled up the sensor data, and Uvex felt her stomach drop. The vessel was moving at 3.7 times the speed of light. That should have been impossible without dimensional folding, and dimensional folding always left traces that their sensors could detect. And this thing was leaving nothing behind. It cut through space like a blade through water, and reality itself seemed to part before it and close behind it as if nothing had happened. What about communication signals? Uvex asked. Every ship broadcasts something, even if it is just navigational data. Nothing, Commander, Kethis said. The vessel is completely silent. I mean completely, and there's no energy signature we can identify, and no radiation output we can measure, and no electromagnetic emissions of any kind. Uvex walked closer to the display and studied the vessel itself. It was small, which surprised her because she had expected something so advanced to be massive and intimidating. Instead, it was barely 300 meters long and roughly cylindrical in shape, with a hull that looked almost primitive. There were no visible weapons ports, and no shield generator housings, and no engine exhausts, and nothing that indicated how it was moving at all. It looked like something a pre-spacefaring civilization might have built in their early dreams of reaching the stars. And yet, it was doing something that the greatest minds of the Velathari Empire had declared theoretically impossible. Have you calculated its trajectory? Uvex asked. Yes, Commander, Kethis said, and his voice dropped to barely a whisper. It is heading directly toward the core systems. Uvex felt cold spread through her body. The core systems meant Velathar Prime, and Velathar Prime was the homeworld and the seat of the Emperor, and the heart of everything her people had built over 12 millennia. How long? Until it reaches the homeworld. At current velocity, approximately 11 hours. 11 hours. In 11 hours, this silent, impossible vessel would reach the most protected planet in the galaxy, and they had no idea what it wanted, or where it came from, or how it was doing what it was doing. Alert High Command immediately, Uvex ordered. Tell them everything and do not leave out any details, no matter how impossible they seem. What should I say about the vessel itself, Commander? Uvex stared at the display where the small crude cylinder continued its impossible journey through her people's space. Tell them something has entered the Empire, she said. Something we have never seen before, and something we cannot identify, and something that moves in ways we did not believe were possible. She paused and watched the vessel for a long moment. "And tell them it is not responding to any attempts at communication." Keva sent the message, and within minutes, the response came back, and it was exactly what UVEX had feared. High Command was mobilizing. The Science Conclave was being summoned. The Emperor himself had been informed, and every sensor array in the Empire was being redirected to focus on this single small vessel that should not exist. UVEX had spent her entire career watching the borders of the Empire and protecting her people from threats they understood, and threats they could fight, and threats they could defeat. But this was different. This was not an invasion fleet they could meet with superior firepower. This was not a diplomatic envoy they could negotiate with. This was something else entirely, and she did not have words for what it made her feel. The other officers in the command center were silent, and she could see the same confusion and fear on their faces that she felt in her own hearts. They were the Velethari. They had conquered dozens of species and built an empire that spanned thousands of worlds and developed technology that could crack planets and move stars. They were supposed to be the most advanced civilization in this part of the galaxy. And now something had appeared in their space that made all of their achievements look like the games of children. "Commander," Kethis said quietly, "what do you think it is?" UVEX did not answer immediately. She watched the silent vessel continue its journey, and she thought about all the things her people believed about the universe, and how they worked, and what was possible, and what was not. "I do not know," she finally admitted, "but I think we are about to learn something about the galaxy that we never expected." The vessel moved on and left nothing behind, and answered no calls, and paid no attention to the Empire that was scrambling to respond to its presence. It simply moved forward as if it had somewhere to be, and nothing in the universe could stop it from getting there. And somewhere in the back of her mind, UVEX realized that she was not afraid of what the vessel might do to them. She was afraid of what its existence meant about everything her people thought they knew. The Empire had believed they were alone at the top. Now they knew they were not, and that changed everything. The throne chamber of Velethar Prime had not seen this many high officials gathered since the last Great War, and that had been over 2,000 years ago. Emperor Valthorix sat upon the eternal throne, and his ancient eyes watched the holographic display that dominated the center of the chamber, and his forearms rested upon the armrests carved from the bones of conquered enemies. He had ruled for 600 years, and in that time he had seen rebellions and invasions and plagues and disasters. Of every kind, he had never seen anything like this. Around him stood the most powerful individuals in the Empire. Admiral Kethos commanded the combined fleets, and his scales were darker than normal, which meant he was deeply troubled. Scholar Varix led the Science Conclave, and she had spent 3 centuries studying alien civilizations, and she looked more confused than the Emperor had ever seen her general. Morthax controlled the ground forces, and his massive frame was tense with the need to fight something, even though there was nothing yet to fight. High Priest Villani represented the religious orders, and she was muttering prayers under her breath, which was not a good sign. "Show me everything," the Emperor commanded, and his voice echoed through the chamber with the weight of absolute authority. The holographic display shifted and expanded, and suddenly the silent vessel hung before them in perfect detail. It was small and simple, and almost ugly compared to the elegant warships of the Velethari fleet. The Emperor studied it for a long moment. "This is what has thrown the Empire into chaos," he said, and there was a hint of disbelief in his voice. "This crude cylinder. Your eternity, Admiral." Kethos stepped forward, and his voice was carefully controlled. "The appearance of the vessel is deceiving, and what it can do is beyond anything we have ever encountered." "Explain." "The vessel appeared at the edge of the Chorus system 6 hours ago without any warning and without using any form of faster-than-light travel that we recognize," the Admiral said. It is currently moving at 3.7 times the speed of light through normal space. That is impossible, General Morthax growled. Nothing can exceed light speed without dimensional folding. And yet this vessel is doing exactly that, Scholar Varric said, and she stepped forward with a data tablet in her hands. I have reviewed all the sensor readings personally, and there is no error, and there is no malfunction, and the readings are accurate. She pulled up a series of charts on the display. The vessel produces no detectable energy signature and emits no radiation and broadcasts no signals of any kind, and it leaves no trail as it moves, and it does not interact with space in any way we can measure. How is it moving then? The Emperor asked. We do not know, Your Eternity, Varric admitted, and the words seemed to pain her. The vessel appears to simply ignore the laws of physics as we understand them. The chamber fell silent. The Velithari had built their entire civilization on their mastery of science and their understanding of the universe and the idea that something could simply ignore the rules they had spent millennia learning was deeply disturbing. What about communication? The Emperor asked. Have we made contact? We have attempted contact on every known frequency and method, Admiral Kathos reported. Electromagnetic and gravitational and quantum entangled. And psionic, and we have tried languages and mathematics and universal constants, and the vessel has not responded to anything. Perhaps they cannot hear us, High Priest Villani suggested. Or perhaps they simply do not consider us worth responding to, Scholar Varric said quietly. That thought hung in the air like a bad smell. The Velithari were used to being the superior power in any interaction, and the idea that another species might simply ignore them was almost unthinkable. Where is the vessel heading? The Emperor asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Admiral Kathos straightened his posture. Velothar Prime, Your Eternity, he said. The vessel is heading directly for the homeworld, and at current velocity it will arrive in approximately 5 hours. The Emperor did not react visibly, but inside he felt something he had not experienced in centuries. Fear. What are our options? He asked. I have ordered 18 battle fleets to reposition along the vessel's projected path, Admiral Kathos said. The Third Grand Fleet is already in position to intercept, and they are our finest warships with our most experienced commanders. Will that be enough? The Admiral hesitated, and that hesitation told the Emperor everything he needed to know. We do not know, Your Eternity, Kathos admitted. We have no idea what this vessel is capable of, and we have no idea if our weapons will have any effect, and we are operating completely blind. Scholar Varric cleared her throat. Your Eternity, if I may, she said. I have spent my entire career studying alien civilizations, and I have analyzed thousands of first contact scenarios, and I have never encountered anything like this. What troubles you, Scholar? Everything about this vessel is wrong, Varric said, and her voice carried a weight of professional concern. The design does not follow any logical pattern, and the technology does not match any development path I have ever seen, and the behavior does not fit any model of intelligent species we have ever encountered. She paused and seemed to struggle with her next words. Whoever built this vessel is not just more advanced than us, Your Eternity, and they are not just operating on a different level of technology, and they are thinking in ways we cannot even comprehend. You sound afraid, Scholar. I am Your Eternity, Varric admitted. For the first time in 300 years, I am genuinely afraid, because I am looking at something that makes no sense, and I do not know how to make it make sense. The Emperor looked around the chamber at his most trusted advisors, and he saw the same fear on all their faces. They had built an empire that spanned thousands of worlds. They had conquered species that had seemed invincible. They had developed weapons that could destroy planets and move stars. And now something had appeared in their space that made all of their power and all of their knowledge and all of their achievements seem small and Insignificant. We will meet this vessel with strength, the Emperor decided. And we will show whoever is aboard that the Velethari Empire is not to be trifled with. Admiral Kathos bowed. It will be done, Your Eternity. But as the Admiral turned to carry out his orders, the Emperor noticed that his scales had grown even darker. None of them believed this would work, that they had to try, because the alternative was to simply let an unknown vessel approach their homeworld without any response at all. And that was something the Velethari Empire could never accept. 5 hours remained until the silent vessel arrived. 5 hours to prepare for something they did not understand. 5 hours that might change everything they thought they knew. About the universe, the Emperor sat upon his throne and watched the holographic display and waited, and somewhere in the depths of space, the small crude cylinder continued its impossible journey without slowing or stopping or giving any indication that it even knew the greatest empire in the galaxy was preparing to meet it with all the force it could muster. The Third Grand Fleet was the pride of the Velethari Empire, and every officer who served in it knew they were part of something legendary. 400 warships formed a wall across space that stretched for thousands of kilometers, and each ship was a masterpiece of military engineering capable of unleashing destruction that could crack a planet's crust or boil away its ocean's fleet admiral. Yorith stood on the bridge of the flagship Eternal Dominion and watched the tactical display with all four of his eyes. The silent vessel was approaching, and it had not changed course, and it had not slowed down, and it had not responded to any of the warnings they had transmitted. All ships report ready, Admiral, his second-in-command announced. Weapons charged and targeting systems locked and shields at maximum power. Good, Yorith said, and his voice was calm, even though his hearts were beating faster than they should. He had commanded this fleet for 40 years, and he had fought in 17 major engagements, and he had never lost a battle, but he had also never faced an enemy he knew nothing about. The vessel appeared on the main view screen, and it looked even smaller and more primitive in person than it had in the holographic displays. It was just a cylinder, a simple, ugly cylinder moving through space at a speed that should have been impossible. Final warning, transmitted Admiral, the communications officer reported. Still no response. Yorith nodded. He had hoped the vessel would stop, or turn aside, or at least acknowledge that 400 warships were preparing to fire upon it. But it simply continued forward as if the entire Third Grand Fleet did not exist. Very well, Yorith said. All ships prepare to fire on my command. He took a deep breath across the Empire. Billions of citizens were watching this moment through live feeds, and they were expecting their military to demonstrate the power that had built an empire spanning thousands of worlds. Cyrith intended to give them exactly that, fire. The word echoed across 400 ships, and in the same instant, the most devastating barrage in Velethari military history was unleashed. Antimatter beams lanced through space in brilliant streams of annihilating light. Graviton cannons fired pulses that could crush matter into singularities. Quantum disruptors released waves that could tear apart molecular bonds at the subatomic level. Plasma torpedoes streaked toward the target, trailing tails of superheated particles. Everything the Velethari had developed over 12,000 years of warfare converged on a single point. The energy released in that moment was enough to unmake a small moon and reduce it to scattered atoms. Every sensor in the fleet recorded direct hits, and the tactical officers reported successful impact, and for one brief moment, Yorith allowed himself to believe they had succeeded. Then, the silent vessel emerged from the barrage, completely unchanged. It had not been damaged, it had not been slowed, it had not even been touched. The weapon's fire had simply passed through it or around it, or ceased to exist when it reached the hull, and the vessel continued forward as if nothing had happened. That is impossible, someone whispered on the bridge. Yorith stared at the view screen, and his mind refused to process what he was seeing. They had hit it. Every sensor confirmed they had hit it directly with enough firepower. to destroy a planet, and it had done nothing. "Fire again," he ordered, and his voice cracked slightly. All ships continuous fire. The fleet unleashed everything they had, and the space around the silent vessel became a storm of destructive energy that would have reduced any normal object to vapor in microseconds. The vessel moved through it like it was moving through empty space. No, not like empty space. It moved as if the weapon's fire simply was not theirs. If it existed in a different reality that their weapons could not touch. And then the vessel did something that shattered the last remnants of Velethari confidence. Stopped, not gradually slowed, but simply stopped moving in an instant, as if velocity was merely a suggestion it had chosen to ignore for 3 seconds. It hung motionless in space, surrounded by the continuing barrage of weapons fire that washed over it without effect. Ioreth watched, and he knew something terrible was about to happen. The vessel pulsed. There was no other word for it. A ripple of something expanded outward from the hull, and it was not quite energy, and it was not quite matter, and sensors could not identify what it was. The ripple touched the eternal dominion, and every system on the ship went dark. Earth stood in sudden blackness as the lights failed, and the engines died, and the weapons power down, and the life support fell silent. Emergency systems did not activate because they were dead to backup. Generators did not engage because they had stopped functioning. Every single piece of technology on the flagship had simply ceased to work in the same instant, and as Yorith stood in the darkness, he knew the same thing had happened to every other ship in the fleet. 400 warships, the most powerful military force the Empire had ever assembled, reduced to drifting hulks in a single pulse. The vessel had not destroyed them, it had not damaged them, it had simply switched them off like someone might switch off a light, and now it resumed its course toward Velethar Prime, leaving the helpless fleet behind. Ureth managed to reach a viewport, and he stared out at the stars with his own eyes since no sensors or screens were working. He watched the silent vessel accelerate beyond light speed and vanish toward the homeworld. He had served the Empire his entire life. He had believed in the power of the Velethari military with every fiber of his being. He had been certain that no force in the galaxy could stand against them, and now he stood in a dead ship, surrounded by a dead fleet, and he understood that everything he had believed was wrong. The Velethari were not the masters of the galaxy. They were not the most advanced civilization. They were not even close. Whatever had built that vessel operated on a level so far beyond them that their greatest weapons were not even an inconvenience. It had stopped. That was what haunted Ureth as he stood in the darkness. It had stopped for 3 seconds and looked at them and decided how to respond. It could have destroyed them. It could have erased the entire fleet from existence, but it had chosen to simply disable them and move on as if they were not a threat, as if they were not even worth the effort of destruction, as if they were children playing with toys. The rescue ships would arrive eventually, and the fleet would be towed back to port, and the systems would probably be repaired. But something had been broken that could never be fixed. Belief that the Velethari Empire was the supreme power in this part of the galaxy. That belief was gone now, and Yorith did not know what would replace it, only knew that when that vessel reached Velethar Prime it would do whatever it wanted, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. The Empire was about to learn Velethar Prime was burning with panic, not with actual fire, but with the chaos of 12 billion people who had just watched their greatest fleet disabled in a single instant by a vessel that should not exist. The streets of the capital city were filled with crowds, and some were trying to flee, and some were praying, and some were simply standing and staring at the sky, waiting for something to happen. In the throne chamber, the emperor sat motionless while his advisors argued and shouted and blamed each other for failures that none of them could have prevented. The planetary shields had been activated, but no one believed they would help. Evacuation orders had been issued for the capital, but there was nowhere to evacuate to. Military commanders demanded permission to launch more attacks, but they had nothing left that could make a difference. Religious leaders proclaimed that this was divine punishment or divine salvation or divine something, and they could not agree on what. And through it all, the silent vessel approached. It crossed the outer defensive perimeter without slowing, and the automated weapons platforms fired upon it, and their shots passed through it without effect. It passed the inner defensive ring, and the orbital fortresses unleashed their heaviest weapons and achieved nothing. It entered high orbit above the capital city, and it stopped. The throne chamber fell silent. Everyone stared at the holographic display that showed the small, crude cylinder hanging motionless above their world. It just hung there. No weapons deployed, no demands transmitted, no actions taken. It simply waited. What is it doing? General Morthax growled, and his hand rested on his sidearm, even though he knew it would be useless. I do not know, Scala Verix admitted, and her voice was barely a whisper. It disabled our fleet and ignored our defenses, and now it simply waits, and I cannot explain any of this. Perhaps it is preparing to attack, Admiral Kathos suggested. And his voice was hollow because he had just received reports that every ship in the Third Grand Fleet was still without power. If it wanted to attack, it would have done so already, the Emperor said, and his ancient voice cut through the fear. In the chamber, it stopped our fleet without destroying it, and it could have destroyed our planet already. If that was its intention, he rose from the eternal throne and walked toward the holographic display. Whatever this vessel wants, it is not simple destruction. And then the voice came. It did not come through speakers or communication systems. It did not come through the air or through vibrations. It simply appeared inside the mind of every Velathari on the planet at the same instant. Clear and calm and speaking perfect, High Imperial, as if it had known their language forever. We receive your distress beacon. The Emperor froze. Everyone in the chamber froze. Across the planet, 12 billion Velathari heard those words, and none of them understood what they meant. The Empire had not sent any distress beacon. The Empire did not send distress beacons because the Empire was the power that answered distress beacons from lesser civilizations. We do not understand, the Emperor said aloud, even though he was not sure the vessel could hear him. We sent no distress beacon. The voice continued as if it had heard him. 73,000 years ago, a species on the fourth planet of this system launched a primitive probe into deep space. The Emperor felt his blood turn cold 73,000 years ago. The Velathari had not existed 73,000 years ago. His ancestors had been simple creatures without language or tools or any understanding of the stars above them. Attached to that probe was a message, the voice said. A plea for help from a dying species that watched their star destabilize and knew they had no means of escape. Scholar Verix made a sound that was half gasp and half sob. She understood what was happening. They hoped that someone would hear them. The voice continued. They hoped that somewhere in the vast darkness of space, there was another civilization that would care enough to help. We heard them. We came. We are sorry it took so long. The words echoed through the minds of every person on the planet, and for a long moment, no one could speak. The Emperor found his voice first. The species that sent that message, he said slowly. They are gone, and they have been gone for thousands of years. Yes, the voice agreed. The species that sent the message is long extinct, and their civilization crumbled, and their cities turned to dust, and their names were forgotten. A pause. But their genetic descendants remain. Another pause. You call yourselves Velathari now. The Emperor staggered, and he would have fallen if his guards had not caught him. The Velathari were not the original inhabitants of this world. They had evolved from simpler creatures over tens of thousands of years, and those simpler creatures had apparently evolved from a species advanced enough to send a probe into deep space. A species that had cried out for help as their world died. A species that someone had finally heard. You have grown, the voice said, and there was something in it that might have been approval. You have built an empire that spans thousands of worlds and developed technologies that reshape matter and energy, and you have become powerful in your own right. But you have also forgotten. You have forgotten that you were once small and frightened and alone in the dark. You have forgotten that your ancestors sent a message into the void, hoping that anyone, would care enough to answer. You have forgotten what it means to ask for help. The Emperor stood in his throne chamber, surrounded by the most powerful individuals in his civilization, and he felt smaller than he had ever felt in his 600 years of life. "Who are you?" he asked, and his voice came out as barely a whisper. The answer came not just to him, but to every mind on the planet. "We are humanity. We heard a cry for help 73,000 years ago, and we came to answer it. We always answer, even when it takes 73,000 years to arrive." The chamber was silent. The planet was silent. 12 billion Velatharis stood or sat or lay wherever they had been when the voice began speaking, and they tried to understand what they had just learned. Their ancestors had called for help, and someone had heard, and someone had come. 73,000 years later, the day had come. The Emperor looked at the holographic display where the silent vessel hung in orbit above his world. It was not an invasion. It was not a threat. It was an answer to a question that had been asked so long ago that no one remembered it had been asked at all. And humanity had remembered. Humanity had kept that promise across 73 millennia. The Emperor did not know what to feel: relief that they were not about to be destroyed, shame that his people had forgotten their own origins, awe at a species that would travel across time and space to answer an ancient call for help, fear of what beings capable of such things might want from them. But underneath all of those feelings was something else, something that felt almost like hope, because if humanity had come this far to answer a distress call from a species that no longer existed, then maybe they were not the conquerors and destroyers that the Velathari had always assumed advanced civilizations must be. Maybe they were something else entirely, and maybe that something else was exactly what the galaxy needed. The being that appeared in the throne chamber looked almost disappointing. Emperor Valthorix had expected something magnificent or terrifying, or at least impressive, given what he had witnessed over the past hours. Instead, the creature that materialized before him was small and soft and seemingly fragile. 2 arms instead of 4, 2 eyes instead of 4, smooth skin without scales or armor or any natural protection, no claws or fangs or any visible weapons by every measure the Velathari used to evaluate species. This human should have been prey, and yet the Emperor found himself more afraid of this small, soft creature than he had ever been of anything in his 600 years of life. "Thank you for receiving me," the human said, and her voice was gentle and warm and completely different from the voice that had spoken in their minds. "I am Ambassador Chun, and I represent the human continuity." The Emperor remained standing because he was not sure his legs would support him if he tried to sit. Around him, his advisors and guards stood frozen with expressions that ranged from terror to confusion to something that looked almost like wonder. "Ambassador," the Emperor said, and he was proud that his voice did not shake, "you have demonstrated power beyond anything we have ever encountered, and you have disabled our greatest fleet with a single thought, and you have traveled faster than light. Without using any technology we can understand." He paused and gathered his courage. "And you did all of this to answer a 73,000-year-old message from a species that no longer exists." "Yes," the ambassador said simply. "Why?" The human smiled, and it was a strange expression that made her soft face look even softer. "Because someone asked for help." The Emperor stared at her. "That is not an answer," he said. "No species expends the resources required for interstellar travel simply because someone asked for help millennia ago, and the mathematics of civilization do not support such behavior, and there must be something you want from us." "Must there?" the ambassador asked, and her head tilted slightly to one side. "Your eternity, I understand your confusion, because your species has built an empire based on conquest and control, and the acquisition of resources, and you assume all advanced civilizations must operate the same way. She took a step forward, and every guard in the chamber tensed, but the Emperor raised a hand to stop them. We thought that way too once, the ambassador continued. When we were young and afraid and struggling to survive on a single world, we assumed the universe was hostile, and that only the strong survived, and that power was the only currency that mattered. What changed? Scholar Verix asked, and her voice was thick with professional curiosity despite her fear. We grew up, the ambassador said. We reached the stars and we found other species, and we fought wars, and we made peace, and we built and destroyed, and eventually we realized something important. She turned to look at the scholar directly. The universe is not hostile, and it is not friendly, and it simply is, and the meaning we find in it is the meaning we create. And we chose to create meaning through connection and compassion, and the simple act of answering when someone calls for help. The Emperor shook his head. You speak of compassion, but you disabled 400 warships without warning, and you could have killed thousands of my people. Could have, the ambassador agreed. But we did not, and every person on those ships is alive and unharmed, and the ships themselves will function again once their systems reset. She met the Emperor's eyes, and there was something ancient and patient in her gaze. We stopped your fleet because they were firing weapons at us, and we stopped your weapons because we did not want anyone to get hurt. And we came here, not to demonstrate our power, but to fulfill a promise made 73,000 years ago. Your ancestors called out into the darkness, and they said, please help us, and they said, we are afraid, and they said, is anyone there? We were there. We heard them, and we came. General Morthax stepped forward, and his massive frame radiated barely contained aggression. You expect us to believe that you traveled across the galaxy and developed technology that defies physics and spent 73,000 years searching simply to answer a distress call from a dead species. Yes, the ambassador said. Why? Because that is who we are. The simplicity of the answer seemed to stun everyone in the chamber. We are humanity, the ambassador continued, and we have made mistakes, and we have caused harm, and we have failed in countless ways across our long history, but we have also made one choice that defines us above all others. We answer when someone calls for help, always, no matter how long it takes. The Emperor felt something shift inside him. He had ruled for 6 centuries, and he had made decisions that shaped the lives of trillions of beings, and he had always believed the power was the ultimate measure of a civilization. But here was a species so powerful that they could ignore the laws of physics and disable entire fleets without effort, and they had used that power not to conquer, but to keep a promise to people who had been dead for 70 millennia. What do you want from us? He asked again, and this time his voice was quiet and sincere. The ambassador smiled again. Nothing. You are the descendants of a species that once cried out for help, and someone heard and someone came. And that is all there is to this. She turned toward the windows where the silent vessel was visible in orbit above the city. We will leave now, and you will probably never see us again unless you call for us. And if we do call, the Emperor asked, if someday we face a threat we cannot defeat, or a disaster we cannot survive, and we send a message into the void asking for help. The ambassador turned back to face him. Then we will hear you, and we will come. And it may take us a day or a year or 1,000 years. But we will come because that is who we are, and that is who we choose to be. She began to fade, and her form became translucent like morning mist in sunlight. Your eternity, one last thing. The Emperor leaned forward. Your ancestors were afraid and alone, and they thought no one was listening, and they were wrong. Someone is always listening, and humanity will always answer. She vanished. A moment later, the silent vessel in orbit began to move, and it accelerated beyond light speed in an instant. and it disappeared into the depths of space, leaving no trace of its passage. The throne chamber was silent for a long time. Finally, Scholar Varric spoke. "Your eternity, what just happened?" The Emperor walked slowly to his throne and sat down, and he felt older than he had ever felt before. "Something impossible," he said. "A species that is more powerful than anything we have ever encountered came to our world not to conquer or destroy or demand tribute, but to fulfill a promise made 73,000 years ago to people who are long dead." He looked at his advisors, and he saw the same confusion and wonder on their faces that he felt in his own hearts. They came because someone asked for help, and they answered. He leaned back in his throne and stared at the ceiling. "I have ruled this empire for 6 centuries, and I have believed that power was the ultimate measure of civilization, and that the strong survived and the weak perished, and that was simply the way of things. Today I learned I was wrong. There is a species out there that has more power than we can comprehend, and they use that power to answer distress calls from dead civilizations. They use that power to keep promises. They use that power to help." The Emperor closed his eyes. "The universe is larger and stranger than I ever imagined, and somewhere in it there are beings who choose compassion over conquest and connection over control, and who will travel 73,000 years to answer a cry for help. I do not know what that means for our empire, or our future, or our place in the galaxy. But I know this: we will never be the same. And perhaps that is exactly what we needed." Above Velithor Prime, the stars shone down on a world that had been changed forever. And somewhere in the depths of space, humanity continued their endless journey, listening, waiting, ready to answer whenever someone called out into the darkness and asked if anyone was there, because someone always was, and humanity would always come, no matter how long it took.